As I drove through the front gates last commemoration day, I couldn't help but cast my mind back to some 55 years before, when I first went through to keep my appointment with the headmaster concerning the teaching post. The teaching post then was for someone to teach commercial subjects in the school. And I gathered it was a completely new post. It was the most impressive. I can still see the towers silhouetted against a beautiful blue sky. And I remember I had a sports car, and I turned round and I parked it outside a window, and I saw a lot of faces staring at me, and I had no idea who they were. They didn't look like boys, and it was only some time afterwards I realised that there were members of the staff wondering who on earth had arrived and what on earth he was doing in a Singer Sports coupe. Well, it so happened that I got the job. And it certainly, and employment in 1930, in the 1930s, it was almost as bad as it is today. And I thought then that teaching in the Royal Masonic School for boys would be safer than working in the Bank of England. Obviously, it never crossed my mind then that some, 41 years later, that the school would be closed, as indeed we found out. Anyway, I got the job, and it was the beginning, I think, of one of the most rewarding, fulfilling, satisfying jobs that any schoolmaster could possibly have had. Wonderful. I had no idea what it was all about, really. I hadn't been into a boarding school. And yet, I was a little fearful because there seemed to be an atmosphere about it that struck me as being rather strange. Everything seemed rather prison-like. It had a sort of odd atmosphere about it. And I think a number of people, and I think even the boys perhaps, noticed it, or perhaps they got so used to it. We were handed a bunch of keys. Every door was locked. Not a lot of laughter about the place, I noticed. And I'd come in from the outside, and I'd led quite a happy life. I was interested in, even then, in the world of entertainment, and it seemed to me quite strange in the school with 400 boys that there wasn't more life. At any rate, I started, and eventually I got settled in. Cross was an academic, and I don't think he really understood what commercial subjects, what they were all about. And quite frankly, I don't think that many of the other staff did either. And what I also didn't realize at the time, not immediately, that there seemed to be two distinct levels in the school. There were boys who hadn't got anywhere, and others who were the academics. They were getting all the attention. And I decided then to devote my life to what one could call, I will call, the C&D side. The forms then were 4C and Shell. And I think Shell described them pretty well. It seemed as though they were living in a shell. But I found them wonderful. I found them loyal. They worked hard, friendly, and one couldn't help but try to do one's very best all the time for them. And that loyalty, by the way, is still in evidence today, because most of the boys, supporters of the old boys, are mostly the C&D boys, I would say, those who are actively engaged. And so something, whatever the word is, brushed off. I felt scared as Billy O when I went in my first lesson. I remember some of the boys very vividly, even now. Two I can call to mind so well. There's one I remember calling Victor Bishop, and George Newman. And to think that some some years later, well, last June indeed, I attended George's 70th birthday party, something which I'm sure we never thought we would do when we eyed each other on the early in September of 1936. In rate, wonderful liaison was formed, and as with many other boys, and it's most rewarding to find that we are still in touch after all these years. So, no. Then I found, for instance, Cross seemed to treat me rather oddly, rather like an outsider coming in. They hadn't got room in the school for me to live. I had to live in lodgings down the road, which meant toing and froing. I wasn't allowed to eat in the dining hall, which I could never understand, for the first year, and neither, except that I had dinner in the master's dining room when I was on duty. And I thought that was rather strange. I never really queried it. And I didn't have all the other sort of little extras my colleagues had, you know, study and sleeping and laundry and everything else. So I went in. I couldn't make ends meet, so I went in one day and said to the headmaster, "May I have a copy of my contract?" He said, "What do you want a copy of your contract for?" I said, "Well, I'd like to know what I'm tied down to. I'm asked to do some duties and things, but I'd like to know. I have a job to carry on as I am financially." And I sort of stirred up the hornet's nest then, because he couldn't find a contract. And he said, "Well, why do you want it?" I said, "Well, I shall have to take an evening post, teaching post," which I did, whether he liked it or not. And for 2 evenings a week, I used to drive over to an evening school just outside Wormwood Scrubbs prison. And I can say that some of those journeys in the winter with this thick fog which took some doing, but I did that for 2 years. And that rather helped financially, helped run the car and things. And then, but the most surprising thing was after my first year, the end of my first year, I got a letter, which must have taken, I think, TRNC a terrific effort to write, when he wrote and said that he'd asked the board if they could increase my salary. And to my surprise, instead of giving me 1 increment, they gave me 3. And then he went on to say that they were rather pleased with what the work that had been done, and that he felt that the C&D form should have no sort of inferiority complex any longer. Well, you know, to someone like myself, I felt it rather badly, because why should boys in a school be made to feel inferior? And so I think I then made an extra effort to try and boost them up a little bit more. Well, luckily, I say luckily, we had one. I tell you one thing. First of all, he was a stickler. I wondered about chapel, and I remember I asked somebody, I think it was Tim Toswell, what one had to do about chapel, because there were compulsory services twice on Sunday. And he said, "Well, if you get in 50%, you'll be okay." And I remember on my mother's birthday, I missed a chapel. On Monday morning, TRNC called me into his office, all muffled up in his overcoat and gowns and mittens. And he said, "Blake, you missed chapel yesterday." And I said, "Yes, my mother's birthday, and I felt I ought to go and see her." And in any case, I thought I'd be able to make it up before the end of term. He said, "What?" he said. "You treat your chapel like a housemaid's holiday? Get out." Well, I thought that was a mean way to go about things, and that didn't endear me to him. And yet he had another side to his character, and I had a period when I wasn't feeling too well. Oh, I must tell you this, I had to sit next to him in chapel, and this is almost unbelievable. And I couldn't understand why he used to go backwards and forwards. He was in the choir, and he used to go backwards and forwards, and then later on, during a hymn or psalm, he would lean right forward, look right down the chapel, and he'd feel into his waistcoat pocket and take out a pencil, I gathered it was, and a piece of paper, and I couldn't think what on earth, and I worked it out one day, what he was doing. He was checking the number of staff who were in chapel. Well, you can imagine, I missed one Sunday evening, and if he knew, he'd never forgive me. Ronald Franco was appearing in the Watford Theatre, and I was a fan of Ronald Franco in those days. I used to do his monologues, so I felt I had to go and see him, which meant I missed the evening chapel. Well, on the Monday, the school ended in the morning about 12:30. And I wasn't feeling too good, I admit, and I let the chaps out round about 12:05, and suddenly the door burst open, and in came TRNC, still with his gown and coat and mittens, but he had his hand under his coat, and suddenly he pulled out a bottle, and he said, "Blake, I thought you didn't look very well in chapel yesterday morning, and I thought perhaps this might do you some good." And I was thunderstruck. So he did have that more humane side, but it came out very, very rarely. Yes, indeed. Oh, I must just mention, I always felt a little embarrassed because I had a gammy leg. I had to walk with a stick. In a way, I didn't fit in with the more, athletics or games and things, and I felt a little out of it, and I had to try and create an interest in some other direction. And when I first went, I always remember so vividly when I went into F House. I was under Richards, and going to see him in his study. Now, all the other houses had 3 men per house, and F House had only 2, and that's why I was put there. And there's no doubt that there was somebody up above guiding me there, because when I went into his study, and I noticed in his bookcase, he had rows of books on conjuring. And I had an interest in conjuring. I used it as a therapy when I was trying to get over my motorcycle accident. And immediately we felt we had something in common. And indeed, we went on from there, because he was quite a fine performer, and he was a first-class ventriloquist. And it occurred to me then that I might be able to develop that side, the lighter side, try to introduce some lighter side to school life. Now, remember when we had, in the Easter term, we had a visit from the Hitler Youth Hockey Team, when they had a job to find anybody to entertain them, apart from, I think, the school orchestra. And someone told TRNC that I conjured. He thought that I conjured a bit. And they asked if I would do a show. Well, it may seem odd to boys today, or old boys today, but I used to wear a top hat and tails and a monocle. I modelled myself on a very famous card manipulator in those days called Cardini. And I remember standing up under the clock in big school, producing these fans of cards from the air and throwing them away, and various things, and watches. I produced watches between my fingers. And I remember finishing up producing ringing alarm clocks from my top hat. Of course, and it's a silent act, so the Germans could understand it. Magic's a wonderful thing for overcoming language barriers. I've always found that. You could conjure to anybody. it's all the same. And but it was interesting then because the lighting in big school was so bad in those days. I doubt if anybody could see me. But at any rate, that was my first appearance in the entertainment world as far as Bushey was concerned. And I think that was the beginning of quite a number of things. And then Crofts went, and of course the great day came in September 1938 when NTS arrived, and immediately the whole atmosphere changed. Warm, laughter, family life. It really was becoming, it was no longer, if you like, an institution, it was a school. And he went out of his way to make it so. Almost within a week he seemed to know everybody in the school, and from then on every boy's birthday was recognized, and oh, he couldn't do too much. It was wonderful, wonderful. And he was terribly interested in the boys who were not so academic. In fact, he spent a lot of time with those. He knew my connection with those and encouraged me to go on and try to give them a boost. He introduced more examinations. And so it just went from one thing to another. And then it came to careers, and I'd always had an interest in industry, and I had contacts in industry and in commerce, and it seemed natural for me to be interested in what boys were going to do after they left, because I could see that there was no real plan of action in the early days. It seemed to be a hit and miss affair, though I might be wrong about that. I know Mallory, he used to do something. And talking over with NTS, he agreed that we should open up a careers department, that I would be careers master, and discussed it with the board. And we worked out a program, and I was given Tuesdays. I could do what I like on a Tuesday, go where I like, which gave me a chance to go up to the city or go to any manufacturing plant, any office, or wherever I felt that I could get real information about jobs and careers. And that gave me a lot of information which I couldn't possibly have got out of pamphlets or books, which I think most careers masters had in other schools. We were members of the headmasters conference schools branch, and we had a careers department in that, and I joined that. We went all over the place. I suppose practically every manufacturing plant in the country I went to. Banks, city offices. I've even seen the vault in the gold vault in the Bank of England. I don't suppose many people have seen that. Now I remember I didn't see many blocks of gold when I went down there, and I couldn't pocket any, I recall. I'd like to talk about the lighter side. NTS did everything in his power to encourage one to develop the lighter side of life within the school. During the war, we had to make our own amusement. I used to run a talent competition, usually on a Saturday afternoon, so we could get sufficient material to put on a show. And I used to do a show. And I also formed, Larry Adler was very much in the news in those days with the mouth organ. And so I built up a harmonica band with a number of boys. We had Mr. Richards was playing the drums, Eric Hawkins playing the clarinet, and one of the boys would play the piano, and I always remember very vividly Ron Rathbone playing. We lost one pianist, and I asked if there was another one. Could anyone suggest someone? And someone said, well, we got a new boy, Ron Rathbone, in A House. So I sent for him, and I can still see him. He was very short. He sat on the stool, couldn't reach the pedals, and he could play anything, any note. He could play any note. Wonderful. Never forgotten it. And I've kept in touch with him over the years. And so we had a harmonica band and used to do, put on shows in big school with that. I wasn't a musician. I could play the musical saw on occasion, very badly, but I used to do that. But there was always on occasion when we could, if you like, do something a little bigger. And let's go back to 1946 when we had what we might call the Christmas Peace Party. We couldn't get into big school because the Ministry of Supply had taken it over, so we had to have the party in the dining hall. And we had everyone had to turn up in fancy dress, and we had everything. We had crackers and sweets and carols and everything. It was tremendous excitement, really. Wonderful evening. And suddenly the end doors of the dining hall opened, and in came a sledge drawn by 6 reindeer, boys dressed up in reindeer costume, with a huge snowball on. And they dragged this up to the front, to the top of the dining hall by the stage, and suddenly it opened, and out popped Father Christmas. And I have to confess that Father Christmas was H.O.B. And it wasn't all that funny for me because I suffer from claustrophobia, and I was shut in this snowball for quite a long time, and I can tell you it was awful. And I remember NTS saying that up popped Father Christmas and handed out presents, which of course I did. And he calling boys by their names. It really was a marvelous evening, and those little things you can't really forget. And then 2 years later, we had another grand party that was for the 150th anniversary. And this took, I think, everybody by surprise, except just one or two, Miss Holyoke and Miss Charlton. Sid, who was down in the engine room, a wonderful person, could do almost anything, and I don't know who else was there. Tom, possibly. At any rate, I had a friend in the magic world who also, apart from being a very wonderful entertainer, had fair apparatus and things in a small way. And I got hold of him to bring those into the school during Prep one night. And we came in through the engineer's drive around the back of the school. And all this stuff was moved into the big school. We had roundabouts and slides. What else do we have? Had a sideshow. There was a chute. There were stalls for fruit and sweets, and the sweets, because sweets were difficult to get, and Miss Charlton made all the sweets, made a pack of sweets for everybody, and there must have been between 400 and 500 packets of sweets she made. And the boys, during a very sumptuous meal in the dining hall, were given token money, so when they came in, they could spend this token money on whatever they liked. And that really was a terrific evening. I should think something which wouldn't, well, you couldn't say you couldn't do it now, but it was the fact that it was such a surprise to everybody. The headmaster knew nothing at all about it, not a thing, until he turned up, and he was in fancy dress. And then later on, now that was 150th, and then in coronation year, we decided to take the school out for a day's outing, and I'd already done a trip down the Thames with one or two people, and it occurred to me that if we could arrange for the whole school to go, it would be a change for them, something new for them, quite an experience. And we got permission. I presume the board paid, I didn't. And we hired two river boats and coaches. And we went down to Windsor, had a few hours, hour and a half or so, I suppose, and walking around Windsor to pack up or buy some extra food or anything. But we all had packed lunches, and we got on these boats, and luckily it was fine. It was fine, and we had this river trip. And again, I would say, as far as the life of the school concerned, it was one of the high spots, yes, indeed. And then going on from there, we used to have the normal school play at the end of every Christmas term. And after the next night, or at least after that had finished, as a Christmas party, we had a lighter entertainment when NTS was quite agreeable for me to bring in, as many of them were real friends of mine I'd met in the concert world, and they came down, and they were all experts in their particular field. I mean, they weren't amateurs, they were professional violinists, professional pianists, or the odd humorist or cartoonist. And it really was a wonderful evening. I enjoyed it because I could compare and do the odd conjuring trick, and it was really great fun. Yes, it really was. And that went right on until NTS left. And I think we had only one after that. It's in Mr. Mullins's first year we had one. And then I think after that, in subsequent years, houses were put on a party. And so that was that, and I rather gradually phased out, I suppose, yes. Now, what else is it to talk about, do you think?
So we've done the boat trip, done the Father Christmas, we've done the magic show. You could say something about the typing room, so I've got a bit of the typing room.
It never... I must have been, in the early days, a bit of a nuisance in the science block, and it never occurred to me, because before I joined the school, I spent 2 years at Clark's College at Ealing, and that's why I thought it was rather strange that I should get the job at Bushey, because the head of the chairman of the Board of Governors in those days was head of Pitman's. Why they should choose someone from Clark's College, I just don't know. But at any rate, so I'd been pretty well drilled into coping with typing, though quite frankly I couldn't type very well myself. But I knew how to do it. And first of all, I should never forget going into the room, the little room up in the science block, and seeing what they had done. Apparently, TRNC had got 2 men in the engine room to make what we call the typing tables. Now, normally in an office, you had an adjustable chair. And the typewriter would be on a desk. But this is just the opposite. They had adjustable tables and just an ordinary chair. and to adjust the tables, you had to have a huge... They were made on steel legs, with wooden blocks underneath. And these huge pipes and big nuts, you had to have 2 big spanners to try and raise these tables. So we never raised the table. And they were so heavy it was almost impossible to move them. I thought that just showed how little he knew about commercial subjects. Never forgotten that. And then and this was new to me, which I picked up it because it wasn't in my university course. I picked up at Clark's College that you had a gramophone record and a wind-up. We had a wind-up gramophone, and you had this record, and I've forgotten how. I only wished I'd kept. There would have been a collector's item. I wished I'd kept a copy. And you had an exercise to do, and it would go 1, 2, QWERT space bar, and you would go on to the end of the line. Then it would say carriage return would come out from this, and all the boys would suddenly all put their carriages back in one go. And there's some who still remember this. It was really an exercise. It's only really comparatively recently, when thinking back over the years, when downstairs they were doing biology next door, they were doing chemistry down below and physics down below, and to have this noise going on nearly all the morning must have irritated them beyond measure, and yet no one ever complained. But I've never forgotten that. And I made them sit up. I used to sit and demonstrate how to do it, and I could do it just using my keys, just one row of keys, because they thought I was doing it all over the keyboard. I can now, of course, and I do after a while, but in those early days it was something almost quite new to me. But it is amazing, really, how even now boys, well, men now, grown-ups, tell me how valuable those lessons were to them, you know. Because the average person can't use a typewriter, or not in those days they couldn't. And they found it quite useful. Shorthand was rather difficult, because again Crofts treated it as an ordinary subject. Therefore you had, 4 lessons a week. Well, the theory for Pitman's shorthand is tremendous. You had a job to cover the theory, and you couldn't write shorthand until you had done the theory. You had to have that background knowledge. And I could never make him understand, really. It ought to have been done every day. And then as time progressed, I had 2 sections in one form, which made it far more difficult than ever. But we did have one chap who became, I think, a shorthand writer in the House of Commons, Huffle, I think his name was. So at least somebody, and some of them, of course, passed examinations, but it wasn't easy to get that across. They still remember, I think, PB, JJ, and things like that. Fascinating. But it was new to them, and it gave them something. They felt there might have been something at the end of them, and you know, it would help them get a job in an office or wherever. And of course, many of them made use of it. With careers, you see, if you had a boy coming from, say, North Wales, and you had no contact with his father, with his mother or relations, and he wasn't very well qualified, and he wanted to go into something, engineering or whatever, and you had, the lodges weren't all that helpful. I have to admit that. We didn't get a lot of help from lodges. And I got permission then to start to go around the country, to go to these places, and I would plan 2 or 3 trips a year, mostly during the holidays, and I would go off for a week or 10 days, and I would then take the opportunity of visiting parents and possible employers. And after that, it seemed natural to do a follow-up to see how they were getting on. And that led into welfare. I think what a lot of them at the school, when I'm talking about the staff now, my colleagues, they didn't realize that a lot of trouble with the boy, if the boy was not a good worker, he had problems at home that were on his mind, and he couldn't pour them out to anybody. He couldn't pour them out to his own contemporaries because they wouldn't understand, and he sort of bottled all this up. And I've had proof positive of this time and time again from well, boys after they have left. And they were glad that I sort of was able to go and sit and chat things over with their mothers. And I found that if you felt that you could bring a bit of comfort in the home as well, it sort of bridged that gap between school and the home. Because even the journey down from somewhere north of Watford was expensive, which they couldn't afford. They just couldn't afford it. And so the boys didn't see any, well, they weren't encouraged in my time, in the first 2 or 3 years, where parents weren't encouraged to come down and see the boys during term time. Then another very odd thing happened too. You might have a family, you might have the mother, the boy at our school and a girl at Rickmansworth. And wouldn't you have thought that they would have arranged half terms to coincide? Because oftentimes the mother had to take a job, and yet more often than not our half term would be on one weekend and the girls' school weekend would be another one. And I always remember another instance when, and let's take Easter, when you would have Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday and Easter Monday. Those 4 days when, if the mother was working, at least she would be at home. And I remember on one occasion we were told that half term, that the Easter holiday would be the week after Easter, which meant that if there was a girl at the school, she would be home for Easter, mother would be home for Easter, the boy would go home the next weekend and nobody there. And it seemed all wrong to me. So it seemed to be a lack of understanding of what was going on at home and what their problems were. And they had many. My word, they had many. Yes.
I think I was one of the lucky ones, so I didn't have any problems at home.
Well, if you hadn't, my dear boy, you were lucky, but some of them had very sad homes to go back to. And then I remember interviewing, these are, you know, you'll cut this out, but these are little interesting things. I had a boy, I remember, I interviewed him one day, and I said, he hadn't any qualifications. I said, I think perhaps it wouldn't hurt if you went into retail distribution. It was a very good opening, really, because whatever you did in a wholesale or a retail, you go in, and if you've got personality and a presence and everything, and you can get on with people, you don't have to have a first-class brain or be able to speak Greek or, you know, whatever.